Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Medоуз, a friend of the university and an American currently living in the United States in Durham, New Hampshire. I thank Professor Tarasova for inviting me to join you today. I've been in Moscow over 50 times. It's one of my favorite cities. I'm sorry I can't be with you today in person, but as you all know, the virus is making travel very difficult these days. So at least I'm able to come virtually to share with you a few thoughts. I'm going to discuss briefly the virus, its timing, and its impact. This is, of course, a presentation which I made especially for you, since I'm not a scientist skilled in these matters. Nonetheless, I have some useful thoughts. So today I will briefly comment on this question. What would have been different if COVID-19 did not appear until 2050? Well, first, it's important to say we're still very early in the life cycle of this pandemic. We can't yet know its full consequences. There's great disagreement about what conditions existed 30 years ago in 1990. So it would be really silly for us to imagine that we can make accurate predictions about conditions 30 years from the future. Now, nevertheless, we can say a few things. We know that the biological effects of the virus are going to last for at least a couple of years. It'll be 2 or 3 years before we have developed vaccines and medical treatment procedures sufficient to bring the virus back down to the level of, let's say, the annual flu. The economic effects are going to last longer than that. The enormous amount of money that's being printed to deal with short-term problems, the bankruptcy of many important service industries like hotels and restaurants, the unemployment that's resulting, these things are going to take some decades until we reach a new equilibrium. And as a consequence, the cultural and the political effects will take 50 or 100 years to unfold. Nonetheless, we can make some useful comments. First, it's important to recognize that COVID-19 is only one of many diseases affecting global society. We have eliminated smallpox, but there are many other diseases such as malaria, cholera, polio, llamas fever, dengue fever that still kill millions of people. And new diseases are appearing regularly: Ebola, HIV, SARS, MERS, Lassa fever, and the annual flus. As humans make greater and greater damage to the natural environment, the environment's natural control systems will be deteriorated, and we can generally expect that many new kinds of disease organisms will escape from the environment. They'll mutate to affect humans and will also at some point cause epidemics, hopefully not nearly as serious as this one. The impact of a disease depends on 3 things. First, on its characteristics, on the physical resources that society has at the time of the epidemic, and on the social capacity to use those resources effectively for fighting the disease. It doesn't help to be a rich country if you're so ill-coordinated that you're not able to respond effectively. So the first item, its characteristics, they are becoming rapidly better understood. We now see that COVID-19 is very infectious. The technical parameter R naught is about 2.3. It means each person tends to infect 2.3 other people. But it's not very lethal. When people are infected, fewer than 1% of them die. In contrast, for example, MERS is very lethal. It has a mortality rate up around 30%. Almost a third of the people who catch it die, but it's not transmitted very well, especially outside of medical settings. Because each person tends to infect less than one other person, it exponentially dies out. The second thing, resources, is really the subject of our analysis. Studying World 3 scenarios can give us some general information about the second item. Third item, which I actually consider to be the most important, lies totally outside the scope of our model. And I have no special scientific expertise for predicting it. Though 50 years from now, we'll look back and decide that it was the most important. I understand the second factor, resources, through the lens of the model that we built back in 1972. So in about 1972, I remember being in Moscow and presenting this work to Soviet scientists. Even then, and this was a scenario which I presented in 1972, we saw that sometime in the period from 2020 to 2050, the long-standing growth trends in population, material use, and so forth would tend to peak out and start to decline. Of course, we didn't predict the virus, but we did know that exponential growth rapidly takes you far above sustainable levels. And when you're above sustainable levels, you need to come back down. You can do it either through proactive policies by humans, such as limiting birth rates, for example, or you can just sit back and let nature pick the forces it will use. And there are three of those. There's always been three. What they are is famine, food scarcity, war, and disease. So I don't expect that the epidemic is in itself going to take population all the way back down to sustainable levels because of its low mortality. Nonetheless, it's one example of the sorts of things that we would have expected to show up. What if it hadn't showed up for another 30 years? What if we had this period without the pandemic? Well, we first of all know that quite apart from COVID-19, the world is experiencing more and more disease organisms. And it's certain that we would have encountered some other infectious disease between now and 2050 if COVID hadn't come along first. That leads us to some positives and some negatives. On the positive side, in 30 years, for sure, biological science will have progressed enormously over current levels. And that will give us much more effective knowledge, tools, medicines for understanding diseases and for treating them and for preventing them. We see that already, how quickly we're learning about COVID-19 compared with the way in which we came to understand some earlier diseases such as polio. Polio took almost 70 years between when it first appeared and when we had a vaccine. We hope that with COVID-19, we can do that in just a couple of years. By 2050, on the negative side, the physical resources available to society for coping with problems will be lower because of depletion and because on a per capita basis, there'll be fewer. We will no longer have inexpensive energy. Depletion will have caused natural resource costs to rise in relative terms, absolute terms. The climate will raise the cost of food production and of creating decent human settlements. And that, of course, just leaves fewer resources for other things, such as coping with disease. Both positive and negative is the fact that global population will probably be generally declining within another 30 years. It's already going down in Russia now. China will peak out in about 2030. It's high in many African countries, but generally the trend is lower. That is on the good side, but of course, as the population goes down, the workforce goes down and the dependency ratio goes up. That leaves fewer resources available for promoting economic growth. And something we don't know about now, the social capacity for confronting pandemics may grow or fall. The form of government is shifting from decentralized to centralized forms. Some governments are short-sighted, other governments have a long-term strategic view. We're jostling now in a time for when each of these wants to be the most important, and it's not clear how it will come out. It depends on the results of the competition that's now unfolding between centralized and decentralized systems. World 3 does not address this issue, and I'm not able to make any particular forecasts about it. So that's the basic brief overview. Of course, many books will be written about the COVID-19 50 years from now when we have a better perspective. But for the moment, I hope that will give you some useful ideas as an input to your ongoing discussions. Thanks again for the opportunity to join you, and I wish you a very successful meeting.